What would you do if the person you trusted most started keeping secrets? If a single night shattered everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and yourself? This is the story of a husband consumed by doubt, a wife shrouded in mystery, and the dark path of obsession that followed. The twists in this tale will leave you questioning who's the real victim, and whether love can ever survive the shadows of betrayal. Stay until the end for a revelation that will change how you see relationships forever. My name is Mark, and for years, I believed I had everything. 18 months into my marriage to Alice, life in our cozy suburban home felt almost idyllic. Alice was everything I ever wanted. Charming, beautiful, and with a laugh that could light up even the darkest days. We met at a coffee shop downtown, where she spilled her latte on my shirt and apologized with a smile that instantly disarmed me. From that moment, I was hooked. Dating Alice was like living in a dream. She brought color to my otherwise monotonous world. But there were cracks even in the beginning. Little things. She'd text friends late into the night, sometimes with a sly smile. I told myself it was harmless, but deep down, a voice whispered otherwise. I ignored it, of course. After all, love is about trust, or so I thought. Our wedding day was a blur of joy, promises, and the start of our shared life. Yet as the months passed, something shifted. Alice still smiled, but it no longer reached her eyes. I found myself asking where she went after work, who she texted during dinner, and why she needed to go out so often with just the girls. She always brushed off my questions with a laugh and a kiss. I told myself I was overthinking. I wanted to believe that our love was strong, unbreakable. But that illusion would soon be shattered. It was a Friday evening when Alice told me she'd be going to a party with her coworkers. She said it so casually, standing in the kitchen, stirring sugar into her tea. "I'll probably be late," she added, without even looking at me. Something inside me tightened. "Late? How late?" She shrugged. "I don't know, Mark. Midnight, maybe later. It's just a party." I could feel the words rising in my throat before I could stop them. "Do you really need to go? We barely spend any time together as it is." Alice finally looked at me, her brows furrowed. "Mark, it's just one night. Why do you always make it a big deal?" I hated that question. Always. As if I was the one being unreasonable. I wanted to argue, to tell her how unfair it was to leave me behind while she went off. But I stopped myself. Maybe I was overreacting. So instead, I said nothing. I nodded stiffly, pretending it didn't bother me. But when she left that night, wearing a dress that hugged her curves a little too perfectly, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. The hours crawled by. Midnight came and went. By 2 a.m., I was pacing the living room, my mind racing with possibilities. Was she with her friends? Was someone else looking at her the way I did? At 4:17 a.m., I finally heard the sound of her keys jingling. Alice walked through the door, her hair slightly messy, her eyes distant. She smiled. A small, strange smile that made my stomach churn. "You're still up?" she asked, kicking off her heels. "Where were you?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. Her response was short, almost dismissive. "I told you I'd be late. Everything's fine." She walked past me, heading straight to the bedroom. But then I caught it. A faint, unfamiliar scent. Men's cologne. It clung to her clothes, subtle but undeniable. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her disappear into the shadows of our bedroom. That night I barely slept. The smell of that cologne haunted me. And deep down, I knew. Something had changed. I didn't confront Alice immediately. I wanted to grab her, shake her, demand to know why she smelled like someone else. But instead, I sat in the dim light of the living room, staring at the door to our bedroom as it creaked shut. The silence was deafening. My mind raced with images, each one worse than the last. Was it her coworker? A stranger? Did she even think about me while she was out? The thought burned like acid in my chest. When I finally mustered the courage to enter the bedroom, she was already asleep, or pretending to be. Her face was serene, her breathing steady. But even in the moonlight filtering through the blinds, I could see that smile from earlier still faintly lingering on her lips. It wasn't a smile I recognized. I stood there, staring at her. Questions gnawed at me, each one louder than the last. Why did she come home at dawn? Why hadn't she texted me? And, most of all, why did she smell like him? The next morning, Alice was back to her usual self. She hummed softly as she made coffee, her hair tied back in a messy bun, wearing the same oversized hoodie I'd bought her for Christmas 2 years ago. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined everything. But then, as I watched her pour her coffee, I noticed something else. She seemed distant. Her movements were automatic, almost robotic, as though her mind was somewhere else. "You didn't say much last night," I said carefully, my voice testing the waters. Alice glanced up at me, her smile too quick, too practiced. "I was tired. You know how these work events can be." I nodded, even though I didn't believe her. "Who was there?" "Oh, the usual," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Some co-workers, a couple of their friends. Nothing special." Her tone was light, but her words felt rehearsed. I stared at her, searching for cracks in her facade, but she was too good at hiding them. Later that day, while Alice was in the shower, I couldn't resist. I opened her bag, the one she'd brought to the party. My hands shook as I rifled through it, hoping I wouldn't find anything. But then I saw it. A small piece of paper, crumpled and shoved into the bottom of the bag. I unfolded it slowly, my breath catching in my throat. "Thanks for an unforgettable night. Call me sometime." A phone number was scrawled beneath the words. My heart stopped. The walls of our house seemed to close in around me as I stared at the note. The handwriting wasn't hers. I heard the shower turn off, the sound of water dripping onto the tiles. My mind screamed at me to put the note back, to pretend I'd never seen it. But I couldn't. When Alice walked back into the room, her hair wrapped in a towel, I was still standing there, the note clenched in my hand. "What's this?" I asked, my voice trembling with barely contained anger. Her eyes darted to the paper, and for a split second, I saw it, a flicker of panic. But then she laughed. "Oh, it's nothing," she said, reaching for it. "Just a stupid prank from one of the girls at the party. They were teasing me." Her explanation was so casual, so dismissive, but I couldn't shake the way her hands trembled as she took the note from me. I didn't push her further, not yet. But that night, as I lay next to her in bed, I couldn't stop replaying her expression in my mind. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to let it go. The next few days felt like walking on broken glass. Every word Alice said, every glance she gave me, felt like a puzzle I couldn't solve. I replayed that moment in the bedroom over and over again, her explanation about the note. "Just a prank," she'd said, her voice so casual it almost convinced me. Almost. But the way her hands shook when she took the paper, the flicker of panic in her eyes, it was enough to keep me awake at night. I became hyper-aware of every small detail, every shift in her mood, every time she glanced at her phone a little too quickly. Alice, on the other hand, acted like nothing had happened. She went about her days as if the world was perfectly normal. She'd hum while folding laundry, talk about her day at work, and laugh at shows we watched together. But beneath it all, I felt the distance growing. One night, as we sat on the couch, I decided to test the waters. "So, you never told me much about that party," I said casually, pretending to focus on the TV. Alice didn't even look at me. "I did. It wasn't a big deal." Her answer was so quick, so rehearsed. "Who wrote that note?" I pressed, trying to keep my tone light, though my chest felt like it was about to explode. She sighed, finally turning to face me. "Mark, I told you. It was a joke. The girls were being stupid." "Which girls?" I asked. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of irritation breaking through her calm exterior. "Why does it matter? It seemed weird, that's all. I've never seen them do anything like that before." "Mark," she said, her voice firm now, "you're overthinking this. You always do." That word again, always, cut through me like a blade. She turned back to the TV, and the conversation ended as quickly as it began. But I couldn't let it go. The next morning, when Alice left for work, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at her phone. She'd left it charging on the counter, something she never did before. My hands itched to pick it up, to open it, to find proof of whatever she was hiding. For a moment I hesitated. Was this who I was becoming? Someone who couldn't trust his own wife? But the memory of that note burned in my mind, and before I could stop myself, I grabbed the phone. Her messages were ordinary at first. Conversations with coworkers about meetings, group chats with her friends about brunch plans. But then I saw a name I didn't recognize. Elliot. The conversation wasn't long, just a few messages exchanged in the last week. But it was enough to make my stomach turn. Elliot. Last night was fun. You looked incredible. Alice. Thanks. It was nice to get out for a bit. Elliot. Hope we can do it again soon. Alice. Maybe. We'll see. The messages weren't overtly incriminating, but they weren't harmless either. Who was this Elliot? Why was he complimenting her like that? And why hadn't she mentioned him? I put the phone back exactly where I found it, my hands shaking. The rest of the day, I couldn't concentrate on anything. My thoughts spiraled, each one darker than the last. That evening, when Alice came home, I couldn't look at her the same way. Every smile she gave me felt like a lie. Every laugh sounded hollow. She noticed, of course. Are you okay? She asked, tilting her head slightly. Yeah, I said quickly, forcing a smile. Just tired. But inside, the seeds of distrust had already taken root, and I knew they wouldn't stop growing. Distrust is like a shadow. You can't ignore it, and it grows with every passing moment. After reading Alice's messages with Elliot, I felt like I was spiraling into an obsession. I needed to know more. Who was this man? Why was he texting my wife? And what exactly had happened that night at the party? I started small. The next morning, when Alice left for work, I opened her laptop. She always used the same password, something she teased me for remembering, Latte 93. My hands trembled as I typed it in. The screen lit up and I immediately went to her email. There wasn't much: work correspondence, online shopping confirmations, newsletters she never read. But then I checked her social media. In her direct messages, buried beneath a string of mundane exchanges, I found him again. Elliot. I can still smell your perfume. Alice. Haha. It's a strong one. Elliot. Not complaining. It suits you. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. It was subtle, nothing overtly romantic, but there was a familiarity in the way he spoke to her. And the way she responded, casual, almost flirty, made my blood boil. I took a screenshot of the conversation and emailed it to myself. I didn't know what I'd do with it, but I couldn't risk her deleting it before I could confront her. But I wasn't satisfied. I needed to know who Elliot was. I typed his name into Google, then into Facebook. It didn't take long to find him. His profile picture showed a man in his early 30s, tall and lean, with a confident smile that I instantly hated. He worked at the same company as Alice. I scrolled through his posts trying to piece together who he was. He wasn't married, didn't appear to be in a relationship. His posts were full of jokes, photos from nights out, and captions that reeked of arrogance. One photo stopped me cold. It was from the night of the party. Elliot stood in a crowded room, a drink in his hand, laughing with a group of people. And there she was, Alice, standing just a few feet away, smiling at someone out of frame. She looked radiant, her dress hugging her body in all the ways I remembered. And yet, she seemed like a stranger. The caption read, "Great night with great people. Let's do it again soon." I stared at the photo for what felt like hours, my mind racing. She'd said it was just a party with her coworkers, a casual night out. But this felt different. When Alice came home that evening, I couldn't hide my tension. She kissed me on the cheek, but I barely felt it. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice light. "Fine," I muttered, barely looking at her. She paused, studying me. "You sure? You seem off." I forced a smile. "Just tired." But I wasn't tired. I was consumed. Every glance she gave me, every time her phone buzzed, every time she smiled for no reason. I saw Elliot's face in my mind. I imagined his hands on her, his cologne clinging to her clothes. That night, while she slept, I sat in the darkness of our living room, staring at the screenshot of their messages. My mind raced with questions, each one more painful than the last. Was she cheating on me? Was I losing her? Or was I just losing my mind? By the time the sun rose, I'd made up my mind. I couldn't just sit in silence anymore. I needed proof, real proof. And if she wouldn't give me answers, I'd find them myself. The next day, I crossed a line I never thought I would. My desperation had become a living thing, clawing at me, urging me forward. I was no longer the man I used to be, the loving, trusting husband. I was someone else entirely, someone consumed by doubt and fear. When Alice left for work, I decided to follow her. It felt wrong, like I was betraying her trust, but the thought of not knowing was worse. I told myself it was the only way to uncover the truth. I waited 10 minutes after she left, just enough time to avoid suspicion. I got into my car and drove, keeping my distance as I followed hers down the winding suburban roads. My heart raced with every turn. I half expected her to notice me in the rearview mirror, to pull over and demand an explanation. But she didn't. She drove to work, just as she always did. For a moment, I felt foolish, sitting in my car across the street from her office. I stared at the building, a gray monolith with tinted windows, wondering what I was even doing. Was this paranoia? Was I losing my grip on reality? I sat there for hours watching the entrance, waiting for something, anything, to confirm my fears. People came and went, laughing, talking, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. But then, around noon, I saw him, Elliot. He walked out of the building, his confident stride unmistakable. He wasn't alone. Alice was with him. They stood on the sidewalk talking. She laughed at something he said, her head tilting back, her hair catching the sunlight. It was the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in weeks. My stomach churned as I watched them. They weren't touching, but there was an ease between them, a familiarity that made my skin crawl. They looked like two people who shared a secret. They walked to a nearby cafe, sitting at an outdoor table. I parked my car down the street and walked closer, staying out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched them through the cafe window. They talked for nearly an hour. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. The way she leaned toward him, the way her fingers brushed her hair, it was enough. At one point, he reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers. She didn't pull away. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. My vision blurred with anger, but I forced myself to stay where I was. Confronting them now would only make things worse. I needed to be smart to gather evidence. When they finally left the cafe, I followed them back to the office. She walked inside without a backward glance, while Elliot lingered outside for a moment, pulling out his phone. I watched him, my hatred growing with every passing second. I wanted to storm up to him, to demand answers, to wipe that smug smile off his face. But instead, I stayed in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. That evening, when Alice came home, I acted as though nothing had happened. I kissed her on the cheek, asked her about her day, and pretended to listen as she told me about work. But inside I was seething. Every word she spoke felt like a lie. That night, as she slept, I lay awake beside her, my mind racing. I'd seen enough to know something was wrong, but I still didn't have the proof I needed. I wasn't done. Not yet. The following day, my obsession deepened. I couldn't shake the image of Alice laughing with Elliot, leaning in close as though they were the only two people in the world. It felt like betrayal in its purest form. I decided to search further. That morning, after Alice left for work, I went into the closet where we kept her things. Her bag from the party still sat there, half-zipped. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. At first, there was nothing unusual. A few receipts, a stray lipstick, some tissues crumpled at the bottom. But then I found something tucked into the side pocket. A matchbook. It was from a bar downtown, a place we'd never gone to together. My stomach twisted as I flipped it open. Inside was a date written in pen. Friday, 8 p.m. That was the night of the party. The realization hit me like a slap. She hadn't just been at a coworker's party. She'd been somewhere else entirely. Somewhere she hadn't told me about. I sat down on the bed, clutching the matchbook in my hand. Questions flooded my mind. Why had she gone there? Who had she been with? And why hadn't she said anything? By the time Alice came home that evening, I was a mess. Every word she said, every smile she gave me, felt like a dagger. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but fear held me back. Instead, I slipped the matchbook into my pocket, determined to investigate further. That night, as Alice slept, I made a decision. Tomorrow I would go to the bar. I would find out what happened. The bar was dimly lit, the kind of place where secrets felt safe in the shadows. It was late afternoon when I walked in, the smell of stale beer and wood varnish hitting me immediately. A few regulars sat at the counter, nursing drinks, while the bartender wiped glasses with a worn cloth. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. The matchbook was in my pocket, its edges worn from where I'd nervously rubbed it all morning. The bartender glanced up as I took a seat. "What can I get you?" "Just a soda," I said quickly. I wasn't here to drink. He poured the soda and set it in front of me, his eyes flickering with curiosity. "You don't look like a regular." "I'm not," I admitted. I hesitated, then pulled the matchbook out of my pocket, setting it on the counter. "I was wondering if you remember anything about last Friday. This place busy." The bartender raised an eyebrow, then glanced at the matchbook. "Friday? Yeah, we had a decent crowd. What's this about?" "I think someone I know was here," I said carefully. "A woman, medium height, dark hair, wearing a blue dress. Does that ring a bell?" He thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I remember her. She was with a guy. Tall, dark hair, suit jacket. They looked cozy." The word hit me like a punch to the gut. "Cozy?" He shrugged. "You know, close, laughing, leaning in. They stayed for a while. Left together, I think." I clenched my hands under the counter, my nails digging into my palms. Did anything seem off?" The bartender gave me a curious look but shook his head. "Not really. They looked like they were having a good time." "Why? Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, though it felt like my face was cracking. "Yeah, just curious. Thanks." He nodded and went back to wiping glasses, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stared at the matchbook, my mind racing. Alice hadn't just been at the bar. She'd been with Elliot, and they'd left together. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they painted was unbearable. I left the bar, the sound of my footsteps echoing on the pavement as I walked to my car. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was happening, and it was tearing my life apart. The days that followed felt like a blur. My thoughts were consumed by the image of Alice and Elliot at the bar, their whispered conversations, their closeness. It didn't matter that Alice hadn't admitted to anything. It was all so clear now. She'd lied. She'd gone behind my back. I kept replaying the bartender's words in my head. They looked cozy. I couldn't shake the thought. It wasn't just a flirtation or a harmless night out. It was something more, something she hadn't told me about. But every time I tried to confront Alice, every time I opened my mouth, the words got stuck. What could I say? How could I accuse her without all the evidence? Without proof? I couldn't just lay it out there and watch her deny it. Instead, I became someone I didn't recognize, quiet, distant, always watching. I'd pick up on the smallest details. The way her phone buzzed and how she'd quickly swipe it away. The way her smile never quite reached her eyes. The way she'd leave the room when I walked in. She was hiding something. The tension between us grew. We ate dinner in silence. We slept in separate beds. The love we once shared seemed like a distant memory. One night, as I watched her scroll through her phone, Something inside me snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. Who is Elliot? I blurted out. The words hung in the air, heavy and accusing. Alice's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. She set her phone down slowly, her expression guarded. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about, I said, my voice shaking with anger. Who is he? What's going on between you two? She stood up, her face flushed with disbelief. Mark, you're being ridiculous. There's nothing between us. I told you we're just co-workers. Don't lie to me, I shouted, standing up too. I've seen the messages. I know about the bar. I know you left with him. I know what you're hiding. She froze, her face paling. Mark, you don't understand. Then make me understand, I yelled. Tell me the truth. Tell me what's been going on. There was a long, painful silence. Alice looked away, her gaze flickering toward the door, as if considering whether to walk away. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not cheating on you, Mark, but I've been feeling something for Elliot. I don't know what it is, but it's confusing, and I didn't know how to tell you. Her confession hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't what I had expected, and yet it was worse than anything I could have imagined. She wasn't lying about the affair, not entirely. But there was something far more insidious here, emotional betrayal. Why didn't you tell me? I whispered, my voice cracking. Why keep this from me? Why keep me in the dark? Alice's eyes filled with tears. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to lose you. But it was too late for that. I turned away, unable to look at her anymore. The trust, the love, it was shattered. I didn't know what to do next. All I knew was that everything had changed. Nothing would ever be the same. The days after that conversation felt like living in a fog. Alice and I hardly spoke, and when we did, the words felt hollow. It was as if the emotional bridge between us had burned to the ground, and all that remained were the remnants of something I couldn't even recognize anymore. She tried to apologize, of course. She said she was confused, that she never wanted to hurt me. But how could she expect me to believe that? How could she expect me to forgive her for not only lying, but for making me feel invisible, unimportant? I kept thinking about that moment, her confession. She hadn't come out and said it outright, but the truth was there in her eyes, in the way she avoided my gaze. She had been emotionally entangled with Elliot. That much was undeniable. But what hurt the most was that she hadn't trusted me enough to come to me with her doubts, her feelings. Instead, she kept them hidden, tucked away like some shameful secret. And now I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I thought was secure. There was an emptiness between us that no words could fill. I couldn't look at her without feeling sick, without seeing her as someone who had betrayed me. I hated that I had to be the one to ask, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop thinking. Was she still seeing Elliot? Was this just the beginning of something more? But every time I asked, Alice insisted she was done with him. She said she was committed to us, that she was trying to make things right. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to hold on to the hope that this was a rough patch we could overcome. But every time she said it, I couldn't help but wonder. Was she saying it because it was true, or because she thought it was what I wanted to hear? My mind became a battlefield. Part of me wanted to walk away, to cut ties and leave all the pain behind. But another part, the part that still cared about her, wanted to salvage whatever was left of our relationship. But could I ever trust her again? Could I ever look at her the same way? That night, I sat alone in the living room, the silence suffocating me. I could hear her moving around in the kitchen, but I couldn't bring myself to speak to her. I didn't know what to say anymore. The phone buzzed on the coffee table, and for a moment, I just stared at it. I knew who it was from, even before I saw the name. Elliot. My heart clenched as I picked up the phone. A message from him. Hey, I was thinking about you. Hope you're doing well. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I didn't even need to open the message to know what it was. It was just another string of words designed to reel her back in, to keep her thinking of him. I clenched my fists around the phone, fighting the urge to throw it across the room. I didn't want to see this. I didn't want to know that he was still in her life, still trying to keep the door open. Alice walked in, and when she saw me holding the phone, her face went pale. "What's going on?" she asked quietly. I couldn't speak. I just handed it to her. She took the phone from my hands, her eyes scanning the message. She sighed, a deep, exhausted sound that broke something in me. "I told you it's nothing. I haven't talked to him like that in days." Her voice wavered, but the damage was done. Her words felt empty now. They were just words. I stood up and walked toward the door. I needed space. I needed air. I needed to get away from her, from this house, from everything that felt like a lie. "Mark, please," she whispered. But I couldn't listen. I didn't know what I was searching for as I walked out into the night. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there. Not anymore. The next few days felt like I was floating in a void. Alice and I exchanged only a few words, mostly about logistics, about the house, the bills, the things that still tied us together in a way neither of us knew how to untangle. And then, one night, she came to me with a tear-streaked face. "Mark, I love you," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can. But I love you." For a moment, I wanted to say something, anything, to make it better, to make this pain stop. But I couldn't. I didn't know if I could ever forgive her. And I didn't know if I wanted to. I woke up to the sound of silence. No words, no laughter, no shared moments. It was just the quiet that had settled between us like a wall, thick and unmovable. I looked over at Alice, lying next to me, her back turned. She hadn't moved, hadn't said anything. Her breathing was steady, but the distance between us felt so much greater than the space of the bed. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't sure what to do. What was left? Could I continue living in this hollow version of a marriage? I loved her, there was no denying that. But love wasn't enough to erase what had happened. The night before, I had asked myself if I could forgive her, and the answer had come quickly. No. But forgiveness didn't seem like the right word anymore. There were too many layers of hurt, too many broken promises. It wasn't just about trust. It was about the way everything had slowly chipped away at who we were. It was the way she had been emotionally distant long before any of this had started. How she'd pulled away in ways I had ignored because I didn't want to see it. I slid out of bed and went to the kitchen. The house was cold, the light from the window casting long shadows across the walls. I poured myself a cup of coffee, but even the warmth of the mug couldn't chase away the chill in my chest. It was time to face the truth. Alice came downstairs an hour later, her footsteps hesitant. When she saw me sitting at the table, she took a deep breath and sat down opposite me. "I know things have been bad, Mark," she began, her voice fragile. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I need you to understand. I didn't want to hurt you. I never did. I made a mistake, and I've been trying to fix it. But I can't fix it if you don't give me a chance." I stared at her for a moment, trying to process her words. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this could be fixed, that somehow we could go back to the way things were before everything had fallen apart. But deep down, I knew I wasn't the same man anymore. Neither was she. "I don't know if I can," I said quietly. "I don't know if I can ever go back to who we were. The trust is gone, Alice. It's shattered." She flinched as though my words had physically struck her. "I love you," she whispered. "I really do. I know I've messed up, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work." I looked at her, my heart breaking, but the truth was clearer than ever. I had to let go. The idea of continuing this way, of living in this state of perpetual hurt, seemed like the slowest form of torture. I wasn't angry anymore. I had passed that stage. Now I was just tired. Tired of trying to rebuild something that couldn't be rebuilt. "I think we both need space, Alice," I said, my voice steady. "I think we need to figure out who we are without each other before we can even think about being together again." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything. She didn't argue or plead. She just nodded as though she knew deep down that I was right. That afternoon, I started packing my things. The decision was made. It wasn't a dramatic exit. There were no angry words, no slammed doors. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt like an ending instead of a beginning. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to feel like a failure. But I knew that if I stayed, I'd only continue to break, piece by piece. As I packed the last of my things into the car, I looked back at the house, at the life we had built. Felt like I was walking away from everything. But it was also a chance for both of us to find something real again, whether that meant together or apart. The car door slammed shut, and I drove away without looking back. The days after I left felt like a strange kind of relief, though I knew it wouldn't last. Alice's absence weighed on me, but there was a quiet peace in knowing I had made the right decision. I no longer had to carry the weight of betrayal. I no longer had to pretend like everything was fine when I felt like I was drowning. At first, I stayed with a friend, trying to make sense of everything. I spent my nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had been too quick to give up on us. But as the days passed, I realized that I wasn't giving up on Alice. I was giving up on a version of us that no longer existed. I focused on work, and slowly, the emptiness began to fade, replaced by a sense of independence I hadn't felt in years. I started doing things for myself, things that made me happy, without worrying about how they might affect anyone else. But even in the midst of finding myself again, there were moments when I thought about Alice. I thought about the woman I once loved, the way her smile used to light up a room, and how easy it was to get lost in the feeling of being in love. Yet, I knew deep down that love wasn't enough. It was about trust, and that, once broken, was nearly impossible to repair. A few weeks passed before I saw Alice again. It wasn't planned, and it definitely wasn't something I was ready for. I had just finished my shift at work when I walked into a cafe to grab a coffee. I wasn't expecting to run into anyone, let alone her. She was sitting at a corner table, her eyes focused on her phone. Her hair was slightly longer than I remembered, and there was a quiet sadness in her expression that made my heart ache, even though I knew it shouldn't. For a moment, I stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. My instincts told me to walk away, to avoid the confrontation. But something pulled me in. I couldn't just pretend she didn't exist. When she noticed me, her face went pale, and she quickly put her phone down. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I hesitated before responding. "Alice." We stood there for a few seconds, neither of us knowing what to say. There was so much unsaid between us, so many emotions I wasn't sure how to process. Finally, she spoke again. "I've been thinking about you," she said quietly. "About everything. And I'm sorry. For everything." I felt a pang of guilt. Part of me wanted to reach out to make everything right. But I quickly reminded myself of all the hurt, all the broken trust. "I know," I replied, my voice flat. "I know you're sorry. But that doesn't change what happened." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything more. The silence between us was suffocating. And in that moment, I realized how far apart we truly were. She was a stranger to me now. "I have to go," I said, unable to stand the tension any longer. Alice nodded without protest, and as I turned to leave, I felt something inside me shift. That old ache, that longing was still there, but it was fading. Slowly but surely I was moving on. Time continued its relentless march forward, and as the days turned into weeks, I began to feel like a new person. The initial pain of the breakup, the rawness of it all, was starting to fade. I still had moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if I had done the right thing, but they were fewer and farther between. I kept busy, focused on work, caught up in hobbies I hadn't had time for when I was with Alice. I joined a local gym, took up running, and started cooking more. Little by little, I was rediscovering parts of myself that I had buried. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was starting to live again. Then one evening, out of nowhere, I received a text. It was from my old friend, Sam, someone I hadn't seen in months. "Hey man, how about we grab a drink this weekend? I think you could use a night out." At first, I hesitated. The thought of going out felt strange, almost like I wasn't ready. But I realized something. I wasn't the same person I was a year ago, or even a few months ago. I had changed, and maybe a night out was just what I needed to embrace that change. I agreed, and we met at a bar downtown, a place we used to frequent together. It was familiar and comforting. Sam was his usual self. Funny, easygoing, always knowing how to lighten the mood. We talked about everything: work, mutual friends, and even Alice. He didn't press me to talk about her, but he could tell I still carried the weight of what had happened. I appreciated that. It wasn't about forcing me to move on. It was about giving me the space to do it on my own. As the night went on, I realized something important. I wasn't alone in this. I had friends who cared about me. I had people who supported me, and I didn't need Alice to define my happiness anymore. When the night ended, I felt lighter than I had in months. Maybe it was the drink, or maybe it was the simple act of being out in the world again, but something had shifted. I was ready for whatever came next. It had been months since I left Alice, and in that time, I had learned more about myself than I ever thought possible. The pain had lessened, the wounds had started to heal, but there were still pieces of the past that lingered. It wasn't easy to let go of someone I had loved so deeply, but I knew, without a doubt, that it was the right decision. One afternoon, I received a call from Alice. It had been a while since we had any real communication, and her name on my phone sent a wave of apprehension through me. I hesitated before answering, unsure of what this call would bring. "Mark, I need to talk to you," Alice said, her voice strained. There was something different in her tone, something softer, less defensive than before. I took a deep breath. "What is it?" "I just wanted to apologize," she said quietly, "for everything, for how I hurt you, for how I acted. I was wrong, and I know that. I've been working on myself, trying to understand why I did the things I did, and I just need you to know that I'm truly sorry." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. It wasn't the first apology I had received, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't just words. It was her trying to make peace with what had happened, and with who she had been. "I'm glad you've been working on yourself, Alice," I said, my voice steady. "But I've already made my peace with everything. I've moved on, and I don't think we can go back to what we were. We've both changed, and maybe it's time to accept that." She was silent for a long moment. "I understand," she said finally, her voice a little broken. "I don't expect you to take me back. I needed you to know." I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "I hope you find happiness, Alice. Truly." And with that, the call ended. There was no dramatic closure, no final argument or lingering questions. It was just the quiet end to a chapter of my life that had once seemed like it would never be over. As I sat in the silence that followed, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over me. I had done the hard work. I had let go. I had moved on. The past no longer had a hold on me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. This was the final chapter of my story. If you've made it this far, you know what it's like to face the pain of betrayal, but also the strength it takes to heal and grow. If you've been through something similar, or if my story resonated with you, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of real-life struggles and triumphs. The hardest battles often lead to the greatest victories. Stay strong.